Hi, everyone. We're going to continue our series, Crushing the Myth. John's Gospel promotes that faith alone saves. And we are going to continue our episodes 2, A, B, C. We're going to do E, F, and G, and so on. But we're going to jump ahead to episode 3. Were the King James translators aware they were mistranslating Pisteuo? In other words, when they did John originally, did they know that the King James Bible was false when they put in the meaning believe in numerous times, where we've shown already, we have 5 examples so far where they clearly missed the mark. And we show that in the last one, in John 2:24, that they clearly knew that pisto meant obey, because they used the word commit for its meaning, which is a synonym for obedience. That Jesus would not commit, would not obey what these people wanted. The same people who had pisto to him, he didn't pisto back. In other words, so they were following him, and or supporting him, and he's not going to do the same thing in return because he doesn't want to. Obviously, there's some difference of viewpoints, and he doesn't want to commit himself to them. And that's how the King James translated it. They knew the word pisto meant obey or commit, synonym. So we know that already, but I had already written an article on this, and I mentioned that in the last episode in 2C, and I want to discuss that article so we can prove beyond a shadow of doubt the King James translators already knew the meaning of pisto was obey, but they didn't do it for very obvious bias towards Paul, because they wanted something to sound like Paul inside the Gospels. And the parables, the way Jesus spoke in the synoptics, was hard to corrupt. So, because the parables prevent that. And by the way, people say, why did he preach in parables? Well, if you try to sneak in a belief and replace the word obey in a parable, then the parable no longer makes sense. But a lot of Jesus' statements in John are what we call expository statements. So you can easily corrupt them because they don't have a parable that protects them. And that's really what the parables were all about. So here's this unprotected book where Jesus is speaking in an expository way that's only in John, and that's what's unique about John. I don't remember a single parable in them. However, that means it now exposed Jesus to corruption by those who are willing to be unethical and deceitful. And that's what we have in the King James Bible. And I'm not pulling punches here, so we're going to look at it hard, and maybe you won't like it, but we have to face the truth. All right. So here's the article. It's online. You can look at it there too. How did the Septuagint use the verb pisteuo, which in John is always rendered as believe? So let me explain even the title. You may not know what the Septuagint is. It's a Bible that was created by a pagan ruler, Ptolemy of Egypt. He ordered it to be done. He created a myth that it was done by divine inspiration. Of course, pagans would say that. The Jewish people never accepted that Bible, and to this day they don't accept it. So it's just simply Christians look at it because Paul quoted from it. But there was no evidence that was ever respected as anything they would want to use. And to them, it's trash. And apparently it's terrible in its translations. But it is some evidence of what Greek words meant. In other words, if somebody had a decent understanding of Hebrew, then that person putting a Greek word with the Hebrew word is telling you what the Greek word means is the same as the Hebrew word. So that's how you can actually reconstruct what the Greek language is, assuming there's some credible nature to the Septuagint translation in the first place. Okay, so that's just the background on the title. There are reasons to believe the King James and others wrongfully assume pisteuo always means believe, especially to skew John's gospel in a Pauline slant. In Isaiah 28:16, a passage that Paul quotes, the Septuagint Greek translation of 257 BC from the Hebrew Bible, it renders a Hebrew word whose root was Aman as pisteuon. Okay, so now we have the same word pisteuo that we see 35 times, 27 times, depends how you count it, in the Gospel of John. So we would conclude, just looking at that possibility, is the word Haman will give us an answer to what pisteuo means, because that's how it's translated in Greek. Aman is translated as pisteuo in Greek. And this is provable by just going to Bible Hub for Isaiah 28:16. Hence, assuming the Septuagint made a proper translation, then Aman in Hebrew is a synonym for Pisteuo, the verb. Then we should add a dictionary definition of Pisteuo. Whatever we find is the meaning in Hebrew of Aman, right? Kind of makes sense. So what does Aman mean? And how is Aman properly translated in Hebrew Bible into English? Then we should update the dictionary meaning of Pisteuo to have at least the Hebrew meaning for Aman, which was equated in 257 BC with Pisteuo, correct? Yes, obviously. What does Aman mean in the Hebrew Bible? According to world-class scholar Jeff Benner in his Ancient Hebrew Dictionary, Foreign Language Study 2009 at 69, he says, quote, the Hebrew root word Aman means firm, something that is supported and secure. End of quote. Benner points out that Aman is used in Isaiah 22:23 for a nail that is fastened, quote, to a secure place. So he's using that as an example to make the point. It's about something that supports something, creates a strength in a relationship between the nail and where it's going. Benner later mentions Aman again and shows how it is erroneously translated as, quote, believe, which he puts gingerly. At page 70, he writes, quote, the root of this word, emet, is Aman, a word often translated as believe, but more literally means support, as we see in Isaiah 22:23. That's the nail fastening something. Quote, end of quote. Benner adds that, quote, a belief in Elohim is not a mental exercise of knowing Elohim exists, but rather our responsibility to show him our support. So that is not belief, and it's not belief in a fact. It's basically obeying or creating a relationship, a covenant relationship with that other person or being, God. It's not about believing in him in some way that he exists. It is a relationship of commitment. There you go, the word commitment or obedience, if you will. Actually, I like that word commitment. The King James came up with for John 2:24 it was. Another related word to consider is emana, which often is translated as believe in English as well, but should not. Benner says it derives from aman again. He explains, quote, derived from this root aman is the word emun, meaning craftsman. A craftsman is one who is firm and secure in his talent. The feminine form of amun is emana, meaning firmness, something or someone who is firm in their actions. When the word emana is translated as faith, as it often is, misconceptions of its meaning occurs. Faith is usually perceived as a knowing, while the Hebrew emana is a firm action. To have faith in Elohim is not knowing Elohim exists or knowing he will act. Rather, it is that the one with emunah will act with firmness toward Elohim's will. That's at page 69. And we have links to that there on the website. Hence, we read in Psalm 33, verse 4 of God, quote, all his work is done in faithfulness, bem umana. So that's how he acts. He acts firmly in his own actions. We can reciprocate and act firmly our own actions towards Yahweh. So that is the meaning of the word aman. There's no concept of faith in believing in him, in his that he exists or knowing he will act or anything else. It's okay. Now, what's going on? Next heading: Pauline bias in this area. As we proceed, we must be on guard from the incessant Pauline bias in this area. The reason is a Pauline bias will equate aman to faith because they know Paul used pisteuo for translation of the Hebrew word aman in Isaiah 28, verse 16. And that was Paul was just adopting what the Septuagint had already done. But instead, let me just add here, well, let's keep reading. And they wish aman to mean faith. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So Paul is taking a text, Isaiah 28:16, that doesn't use the word faith, uses the word for supportive action, basically, not anything to do with acknowledging a fact or anything like that. And Paul is using it, and he uses a verb, pisteuo, and they want that to come out to mean faith or belief. And that's how it's translated typically when he quotes this text. But here's the reaction to this by an expert. Claude Tresmontant in Hebrew Christ, Language in the Age of the Gospel, 1989. He explains at 151. We moderns who speak about believing in faith are off the mark as far as the original meaning of these concepts. Claude says Paul, quote, has played on the various meanings of the derivation of the Hebrew word Aman, but, quote, this is not immediately evident in the Greek translation. In other words, Paul is using a Greek word that may or may not reflect properly the original Hebrew word. And so that's what he's saying. He's going to say is, well, the word believe does not carry all the meaning. Well, what he doesn't know, apparently, he doesn't know Greek enough. He knows Hebrew very well, obviously, but what we're showing you is the Greek actually had a meaning that would match a higher elevation, which is commitment or obedience. And he doesn't know that. So he's saying that the use that Paul's making of this word Aman, and then using the Greek word Pisteuo, which he's been told only means believe, he's saying that doesn't convey all the meaning. Claude also, quote, decries the error, distortion, falsification when the Greek word pistis was translated as faith. Well, what he's saying there is that, and he's correct, is the word pistis means obedience too, because again, Pistis was a female character in I'll say literature, because many plays were made about her, but she happens to be a sort of a goddess type figure. And she's actually a demon, but a good demon, like a sprite is in Celtic lore, that kind of thing. The leprechauns, she's a good one, and she's known as very faithful and very obedient, and so on. And that's why the word pistis passed into the Greek language as having the verb that would reflect her way of living. It wasn't about a faith; it was about the way she was so obedient and sweet, and she was like Tinkerbell. You ask Tinkerbell to do something, Tinkerbell does it. That's what this pistis was. So she was very obedient to her master, or whoever who she served. And that's why pistis came to be understood as obedience. First and foremost, if it had a secondary meaning of believe in something, that was something that came later, but is not the primary meaning in any Greek's mind. When you hear the word pistis or pisto, you're going to think of the little pistis. It's hard to imagine how we could talk about it, but anyway, but if you thought of a cartoon character and you said Bugs Bunny, oh, he's a Bugs Bunny. What if our language said, don't act like bugs? Then everybody knows what you're talking about. Don't act like a smart aleck. That's what was Bugs Bunny's whole routine. Same idea. Don't act. Actually, people would say, please act like Pistis. So moms and dads would say, couldn't you act a little bit more like Pistis? That beautiful Tinkerbell character you saw in the play last night. That's what it meant to the Greeks. So he's just decrying the fact that when the Greek word pistis is translated as faith, that is an error, distortion, and falsification. The man is very, very correct in that way, because it's not its only way of being perceived. Now, the reason is that Aman conveys a trust, steadfastness, that mere belief would never convey. So trust and steadfastness, by the way, are both inside of Pisteuo. So the trust aspect of it is one meaning of Pisteuo, and steadfastness is more the obedience or commitment, if you will. So the word belief or faith does not convey trust and does not convey steadfastness, commitment, or obedience, right? So the word faith or faith alone, if that's your doctrine of salvation, yet God in the law and the prophets, as well as in the New Testament with Jesus really being translated correctly, you're on the wrong path if you think belief alone is going to make it to you, despite we can all acknowledge, Paul clearly says, if you believe in three facts, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, you shall have eternal life. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4. If you want to take and gamble all of your future, your entire eternity on the truth of that statement, then go ahead and keep ignoring what I'm telling you. Keep ignoring what Jesus is teaching. Keep ignoring all these commandments of Jesus. Keep ignoring all of the book of John that is completely contrary to the idea of faith alone. When you properly translate it, go ahead and keep doing that. Or be patient, listen, and see if you can find truth, and then verify, test and verify. What I'm saying can be verified. That's the whole point. It's Paul who can't be verified. When you test him, he fails. And I'm showing you the failure he suffers. And hopefully I'm doing it correctly, and therefore this won't be wrong in the way we correct Paul's mistakes. And thus Paul's use of the quote of Isaiah 28:16 with the word Pisteuo, unless rendered as steadfast following or obeying, is misleading. So just to comment on my own comment there is maybe Paul did mean obey. Now we all know that's probably not what he meant, but if he did, then he would not be wrong. But if he meant faith, then he's wrong, because it doesn't mean the word Aman in Isaiah 28:16 does not mean anything but steadfast following, and it does not mean or obeying, and it does not mean believing. Here is an example of the problem of such blind bias from a typical popular author who defines Aman very different from Pisteuo, and while defining Pisteuo to only mean faith, which it isn't, then equates it to Aman. Wow. Evidently aware of Paul's translation of Isaiah 28:16's Aman as Pisteuon. The author ignores they are totally different and pretends Aman is saying the same thing as Pisteuo, and then pretends trust in is the same as faith. Okay, now let's read what this is Tiffany Schmigotsky Cheryl in Undiscovered Treasure at page 36. The question is asked, what is faith? The Hebrew root word for faith is Aman. Now, is that true? No. It doesn't have any concept of faith, according to Brenner. And then it goes on, it says, which means, quote, to support, to foster as a parent, to render firm and permanent, to go to the right hand. So where did they get this idea that faith, remember they start with what is faith, and then they are telling you the root word for faith is Aman, and then they define it to mean something that doesn't have anything to do with faith. To support, to foster as a parent, to render firm and permanent, to go to the right hand. How does that have anything to do with faith? This is what I talk about as crazy talk. This is where people go crazy. This whole topic area, you have scholars who are crazy. They drive themselves crazy. How can you say the word faith is to mean these other things? But I digress. The Greek word for faith is pistos. No, it isn't. That's an adjective. Oh, yeah. And means to trust in, I mean, that's verbs. So I'm not sure these people very, very much knew even the Greek language when they're talking here. So all I'm saying is this is the level of quality you get people who defend that Aman in Isaiah 28:16 could be meaning faith. You'd have to go to these crazy lengths to make an equate these two things. Okay? And I'm sure they meant well. I'm not saying they didn't in good faith do this, but it's totally untrue. That's all that you need to know. It's people who apparently don't know much about Greek. Pistis is the noun. If you want to say faith is something, it's not pistos. Anyway, so this is where you're left in this level of scholarship. So now I want to show you something else. Now, so in other words, 28:16 does not mean believing, yet Paul quotes using the verb Pisteuo. So the question is, does he mean believing as it's translated in every Bible, all 30 of them, or does it mean steadfast obedience, right? Now I want to show you what a very doctrinaire, pro-Paul, faith alone website itself has. The next two things I'm going to show you, next two slides on it. And this is right from preceptaustin.org/Hebrew definition. So they're trying to tell people, here's some Hebrew words and what they really mean and how we interpret them as Christians. So we're going to give our own definitions to stuff. So now what are we going to do here with the Septuagint? The Septuagint is that 257 BC translation. It's often abbreviated as LXX, meaning in Latin, Roman numerals, the number is 70. There was a myth that there were 70 Hebrew translators who went in separate places, and they each did a translation of the Torah, and each of the 70 came back and had the identical words in Greek as they for each of their translations of the Torah. And if you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I can sell you. And remember, we're not talking about the Jewish people saying this. This is the authoritative pagan ruler, Ptolemy of Egypt. So he wanted to make his subjects, calm down and have a single book. He didn't want them to have multiple texts and have, arguments. So I'm going to give you one text, and that's the authorized text, sort of like King James is the authorized text. All right. The Septuagint translates Aman in Genesis 15:6. So says Precept Austin, with the Greek verb Pisteuo. So there you go. So doesn't that answer it? So there's your faith alone, and that's where Paul gets it all from. Which, like Aman, represents not just a mental assent. One has to, of course, first have a mental apprehension or grasp of the truth. But as W.E. Vine, and now this is important, he is quoting someone who doesn't disagree with him, and he doesn't get it. Because Vine is correct what he's saying here. As summarized, includes a quote, 1, a firm conviction producing a full acknowledgement of God's revelation or truth, 2, a personal surrender to that truth, and 3, conduct inspired by that surrender. He just doesn't seem to get this, as you'll see in the next quote I'm going to give you from him. So Vine is correct. So whatever the Septuagint was trying to say, the word Aman had to have these three components, not just faith alone, but also conduct inspired by the surrender to that truth. All right. So Paul is citing Genesis 15:6 in Romans 4:3-4 to mean something quite different, that you can get away from having to obey God, just believe that he gave you a promise in old age, as Abraham did, or some other promise or some other truth of God, and you are off the hook. You don't have to do anything else. Paul's very clear. If you do anything else, you're trying to be saved by your works, and the risk to you will be you'll boast, and now you'll sin and lose salvation. So that God has made a new plan that guarantees you can't ever boast, is you just simply believe in certain facts, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And since that doesn't depend on anything you do, you can be free of boasting any longer, and you're going to go on the path to heaven forever just for those three facts. He says, you shall be saved. That's 1 Corinthians 15:1-4. I do not dispute that. I dispute that those are the words of God, because it's not true. It's contrary to Jesus. It's contrary to these words you're reading right here on the page. We'll take a break. Now, what I'm going to show you next is why I say Precept Austin can include something like this, shockingly contrary to his own viewpoint, in another place on the same page. So here we go. Caveat. So I think that the idea here is that you might see something else on the page here, my definitions, but this is where ultimately it all comes down to. So he says this, actually this is his writing, whoever runs Precept Austin. The use of the Hebrew verb aman in Oh, okay. I think I already read that. No. Wait. The Hebrew verb aman in Genesis 15:6 provides the key to how a man or woman was saved in the Old Testament. Now, this is ridiculous. Okay. Nobody ever looked at Genesis 15:6 as a path to salvation for anybody. Paul made that up. It was never even said that this is the way you will get saved, by believing that God made a promise to you in the past and you believe it and you're going to heaven because of that one promise. It's ridiculous. It's off the charts and loony. Get this on a piece of paper, and he's going to cite a scholar who's going to agree with this, Wendell Johnston. This is what people have gone nuts to justify the unjustifiable arguments. But I digress. And that the key is by grace through faith, just as in the New Testament. So I mean, it's one thing if you want to say the New Testament saint could be saved by faith alone, maybe, I don't know, but clearly to say this is true for the Old Testament is ridiculous. And we'll show you why. Old Testament saints were not saved by works of righteousness. Oh my gosh, Romans 30, Romans 3:20, Romans 9:11, Romans 11 verse 5 and 6, Ephesians 2:8-9, 2 Timothy 1:9. I mean, that only makes it look ridiculous. It makes Paul look ridiculous if you're saying he said the Old Testament saints were not saved by works of righteousness. Give me a break. Or by keeping the law, Deuteronomy 27:26. No. And he cites Galatians 3:10. James, no way. But we'll deal with that another day. So that's false. These are all false statements. Or by performing the prescribed sacrifices. Well, golly, what is Jesus? Do you believe he's your atonement? Then why does that have to be done at all? If sacrifices don't cover sin at all, they have no role in that. I mean, this is like, what? But he's going to cite someone who's supportive of this. All right. Wendell Johnson writes that. So this is in a book called The Theological Workbook at page 111, 112 there at the end. So I'm just jumping ahead so you can see it down here at the bottom. The Mosaic law was the rule of life for Israel, but salvation came, as it always does, by faith, not from keeping the law. With the law came a greater realization of God's character and a deeper understanding of their unrighteousness. The law demanded complete obedience to every detail, something impossible to do. So I guess when it said Noah was perfect in all his generations, I guess he didn't get the message that this was impossible. And there are other righteous people, and other than him, I'm just picking one out of the hat. I think Job was the other one. According to God, he was a righteous man and always had been. And if this is true, this gentleman forgets that Paul claims that he was without any sin. Any sin. He was. He even swore an oath to the high priest. He said, "In all good conscience, I've committed no sin in my life." And the high priest had him slapped because it was so ridiculous. Even anybody knows that Paul was out murdering people and abusing people and violating all kinds of criminal law statutes that you had to have a trial and a hearing. Stephen is killed and executed by a mob of angry men outside. It's just, it's just, it's just anybody would have been. I don't think nobody should slap Paul for that, but it's just simply that was the point. Is Paul would say he was righteousness in every way. How did he do that? Okay. Anyway, the thing is that we're going to show you something that most people don't see. I'm going to show you. Okay. Here's God's principle of mercy in the Bible, in the law. Between the first and the second commandment, you will read basically God. If you read the whole sentence, it will be God, I show mercy, Hesed in Hebrew, unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. And basically it says thousands of generations. I don't know why the King James called it thousands, but anyway, it's thousands of generations. It's correct in the NIV that way. But now notice the difference between the two passages. Do you see something that's been eliminated? Now, if you go back here, I just want to show you something. If you were a believer that God has given the law with no purpose of giving you a path to salvation, you're the minute you commit a sin, you're damned. This is Paul's doctrine in Galatians. If you try to keep one command, you have to keep them all. If you don't keep them perfectly, you're guilty of all. That's not the way it's spoken in the law itself. Okay, so if somebody says that, it's dicta. Unless God gave a new revelation changing what it's in the law to Moses, that's not something that's true, because it's false, biblically false. Okay, so did God demand complete obedience to every detail? That's the whole point of this. Like making it sound like it's so impossible. It's an impossible standard. God didn't give you an impossible standard. He emphasized how it was not burdensome. That's in Deuteronomy 30 and 31, I think it is. So yeah, so God was emphasizing this isn't hard for you. It's easy, and it is. 10 Commandments. Jesus gives 120. The 10 Commandments are easy by contrast, and that was the covenant. The covenant ends at the end of the 10 Commandments, and then there are laws that are given later in time to deal with civil issues. Like a civil society needed all kinds of civil laws, and that's a lot of what the law is like tort law, criminal law, that kind of stuff. But the moral law and all that kind of stuff is in the 10 Commandments in particular, and then two other sections of the law called the Levitical Code, the Holiness Code inside of the book of Leviticus, from Leviticus 17 to 23, I think it is. And then there's also the Covenant Code, which is the 3 chapters after the 10 Commandments, where you have these what's called the judgments of right and wrong in different categories. But it's not that hard, and so difficult. Well, maybe the sacrifices had to be done just right. That's one thing. Maybe that had to be done exactly right. So maybe he's got a point there. But the point is this: it is not impossible. Because why? Because God made it not hard. You want mercy? Then just restore your love for me, love me again, and keep my commandments. Go back on the right path. And sometimes it requires repentance of certain, even paying monetary money, damages, or refunding money you stole, or things of those sorts. So what do we have? We have a gospel on the left side. When you get rid of any word of grace, such as mercy, from the left side, you can make it look like there was never a gospel of grace based on works on the left side, and make it all look like it's grace by love at all times, meaning there was no principle that you had to love God and obey his commandments to get mercy. That would be what? Works righteousness. But if you put the word mercy in the garbage and you put the word love there, Now it just could be consistent with the gospel of faith alone. See, this is not a mistake. Okay, so I want to show you that the translation by the King James was the correct translation by looking at a word study I did on the word Hesed. It's Strong's number 2617, and we're going to see it's in all these different passages here. And then I'm going to make a comment on what this teaches us, what the meaning is. Is it love or is it mercy? Okay, first I want to show you my word study on the word Hesed here, just so you can see how clear this is. So it's not just Exodus 26, Exodus 34:7, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and there will by no, but I will in no means ever clear the guilty. And that means someone who's unrepentant, the ungodly. If you read Romans 4:3-4, Paul says that in accepting faith alone, God justifies the ungodly or the wicked. And you have here a complete contradiction in Exodus 34:7. I will never, ever forgive or allow justification to someone who is what? Guilty. What does that mean? They have not repented. Once you repented, you followed the steps of mercy I showed you in Exodus 20, verse 6. Now God will do it, but never that. Next, Numbers 14:18. The Lord is long suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, by no means clearing the guilty. Wow. Again, in Deuteronomy 5:10, the same thing is in the Ten Commandments. This is actually connected to the second rendition of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5:10. And I show mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. And notice here, Luke 1:50. Now, this is in Greek, and his mercy, in Greek it's Eleos, is on them that fear him from generation to generation. That sounds a lot like the Deuteronomy words, generation to generation. Okay, so I think I've made the point that there is abundant use of the word Hesed in the Bible, and it's not just that one verse there. Now, I want to read to you an article on Hesed, which in this iteration in the Wikipedia, it's spelled Chesed, but it's Hesed, or at least that's how it's pronounced. Romanized, it's Hesed. It even says so right here. Okay. It's a Hebrew word that means kindness or love between people, specifically of the devotional piety of people towards God, as well as love or mercy of God towards humanity. So when we would show Hesed towards God, it would be called love to God. We were loving God because we can't show mercy to God. God can do us no wrong. So that relationship, it's a one-way thing. So when it speaks of love, meaning that's when it's between people or between us and God, in the direction of God. But when it's God towards us, it's mercy. Do you see the distinction there? Okay, so I want us to know ahead of time. I'm going to read something to you in a second. Is in Greek, if I translated Hesed as Eleos, what am I saying about the meaning of Hesed if I were this scholar, alleged scholar, in translating the Septuagint from Hebrew to Greek? I'd be saying it means the Hebrew word must mean Eleos. And let's look at what the Greek word for Eleos means. This is according to Mouncy in his Greek dictionary, and then he has glosses and definitions. So first of all, I want to show you what the gloss is. That's what is not specifically the definition, but it's to have mercy on, pity, to show mercy, to show pity to another who is in serious need, usually with focus on an act of kindness that will help meet the need. So that's how generally it's understood what it's talking about. But what's the definition? As formed as Elion, to pity, have compassion on, pass, to receive pity, experience compassion, to be gracious to anyone, show gracious favor and saving mercy towards, passive, to be an object of gracious favor and saving mercy. Okay, so this word, Eleos, is used by Paul in Romans 11:30-31 as how you receive grace from God, right? It's how you show also how God shows forgiveness to us, Eleos. So this is no doubt, and it's used many times. Look at all the times it's used in the New Testament. It's used to mean grace. Okay, mercy and grace are synonymous. At least now, look at the Old Testament, the law and the covenants. What about its meaning of conditions of mercy. What did you have to do? Is it an impossible thing where you can never get mercy? That's what it. But if you can erase the meaning of mercy out of the Bible, take it out of the King James where they belong, then you've erased any conditions. And God has no plan of mercy or salvation at all for any Israelite. And that's what that guy was saying. That person quoted at Precept Austin is trying to say there was no plan of salvation other than Genesis 15:6, which is ridiculous. The alleged claim that Abraham became justified by believing God's promise of an old son in old age. That somehow was the archetype of how everybody had to be saved in the Old Testament. That's bogus. It's completely ridiculous. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the point I want to bring you to, the conclusion. Okay, so now with the understanding what the word Eleos is in Greek, it only means to have mercy or give pity, and it's equivalent and means the same thing as grace. So now we're going to look again. We've said here is Exodus 26 in King James, and it's translated mercy. Unto God show mercy to thousands of them, thousands of generations. They love me and keep my commandments. It has been erased. Mercy is no longer present. It matches what we see this man says here. The law there was no possibility. There was no justification by loving God and obeying his commandments. No. That would be works. It was always by faith. It was always by Genesis 15:6. Ridiculous, but that's what he says. And you see what happens. Exodus 26 in the NIV erases the word mercy and grace. And we no longer know there was a gospel of grace in the original law, right? That's what is intentional. So now I'm going to show you why the Exodus translated Exodus 20 verse 6 to be mercy. How often was it translated in the Septuagint Greek translation of 257 BC? How often was it translated as Eleos? We'll see. Okay, so we're looking here at this article, Hesed. I'm going to pronounce it Hesed again. And we're going to see here, it says the word Hesed occurs 248 times in the Hebrew Bible. In the majority of cases, 149 times, the King James Bible translates it as the word mercy. Now, why did it do that? Because it was following the Septuagint Greek translation of the word Eleos. And I just showed you that is exactly what its primary meaning. Now, sometimes the King James translation did not comport with that meaning. And so take 149 and subtract it from 248, you get about 199. So, not 99. 99 times they didn't do that. They did 40 times with the word kindness, 30 times with loving kindness, 12 times with goodness, 5 times with kindly, 4 times with merciful, which is really similar, favor 3 times, which is similar, and good, godliness, pity once each. So really, pity, favor, merciful, those should have been included with the concept of mercy. So you really only have 40, 30, 70, 82, 87 times it's using a meaning that's different from mercy in the King James. Now, the Greek still says Eleos each time. It's each talking about mercy. So only 87 times did the King James dare to not translate correctly because they felt the context wasn't God talking about his mercy or grace for whatever reason. But they acknowledged in Exodus 26 they would follow the Septuagint Greek translation, which only means mercy and grace or grace. Do you see the point? So they're not perfect at following this rule, but they disobeyed it only a minority of times, but most of the time they followed the actual meaning of the Hebrew and they translated correctly in Exodus 20 verse 6. But what about the NIV? Not if you're looking, the NIV did it completely wrong. If you're looking at the Septuagint, that should be your guide as what the meaning was as of 257 BC at least of the word Hesed in everybody's mind. It was the word Eleos in Greek, which has no other meaning than the meaning. The definition is mercy of all varieties of ways of saying the same thing. All right, so that to me shows corrupt, biased intent of the NIV to destroy a meaning it could itself see was in the KJV and could have itself figured out exactly what this article is telling you. These things, this point was something that couldn't have been lost on NIV. It's right here in an article by Wikipedia. Not that it was existent back in 74 when it started this project, but at least by 2022, it knows. The scholars have scoured over, and they realize, oh, this is why the KJV did this. It was looking at the Septuagint. It was following the Septuagint, right? All right, so now I'm going to stop and we'll come. So now I want to go back to this screen because the same principle works in reverse. So we know with the word mercy and the word for Hesed, that because in Greek, Eleos has no other meaning, that tells us, that unlocks the meaning that we can rely upon. What did the meaning of Hesed mean? So that helps in the direction of knowing what the Greek word is. We can find out what the Hebrew word certainly was. The same thing applies here. Aman has no meaning of faith. That's the whole point. It never meant faith. It only meant basically, exactly as Vine says, it required not just simply a conviction that something was true, but that it would inspire you. It included your conduct inspired by that conviction of something that you believed was true. So it's really just a way of saying obey or commitment. And that's what the Septuagint was saying. And so there was no way to get out of it. If the word in Genesis 15:6 and everywhere else that it's translated, the word Aman is translated in Pisteuo, that tells you, if you had any question or doubt what Pisteuo meant, it meant that it at least had the meaning of Aman, which was not belief or faith. That is a corruption backwards. There was people who will actually say that Aman means faith when it does not mean faith. Pisteuo or Pisteuo can be translated that way, but Pisteuo can also be translated as commitment, obedience, and things that do match the word for Aman. And that's how you know that Aman had to at least have that meaning. And we knew it independently. Even if we didn't know, we can use Pisteuo or Pistis, either one, to prove backwards looking that that is one of the meanings of the word Aman. And therefore, you have a doctrine of salvation by basically stubborn persistence after God and a steadfastness to follow God and his ways. That's how you are saved. And then that's what you do for repentance. If you fail, you go back to loving God and obeying his commandments in the same way of Aman. And that's what Pisteuo was translating. So now you can know what Pisteuo's second meaning was. If you somehow forgot that it meant obedience and commitment, you could always restore it. And therefore, I'm going to say for a fact that because we now know the King James Bible translated directly using the Septuagint as a tool to translate the meaning of the word mercy, right? 149 times it followed the word Elio, but other times it didn't, but it did 149 times. So that means they were consciously aware of why they were doing what they were doing there. Here, when it comes to the word Aman and Pisteuo, they should have been consciously trying to make sure Pisteuo matched Aman whenever the person like Paul was quoting, like he quotes Isaiah 28, he's quoting backwards. Well, you can't use one narrow meaning of Pisteuo. You need to find out what does Aman mean in Isaiah and then translate Pisteuo to include that meaning, because the meaning of Aman is not doubtful. The meaning of Pisteuo really isn't doubtful, but you're pretending you don't know what it means, okay? Because they never ever once translate Pisteuo as obey. Once we found out so far they've translated it when it's kind of in a disguise. They call it Jesus did not commit to people, and we showed you that in John 2 verse 24. Okay, so I know this is a long explanation, but this is very important because we need to know that the King James translators did know everything about the meaning of Pisteuo, and they just don't want to hear it because it goes against the grain of their doctrines, their loyalty to everything that has to do with Paul, but not a loyalty to Jesus's words being uncorrupted and we're able to hear what he's telling us. And as I said in our first episode, it's clear that Jesus uses the word obey in synonyms. Tereo is one of them, to mean salvation is dependent upon tereo. So he does that 2 or 3 times, right? We showed that in the first episode. Now he's using another verb, pisteuo, or at least that's how it's being rendered by John. And that is clearly, it has to comport with what Jesus says about tereo, right? You cannot have a different two different doctrines of salvation for Jesus. So if he said tereo is how you get saved, you have to obey John 8:51, those who obey unto me, tereo unto me, shall never see death. That's what he says, right? So now you have to have pisteo have a meaning that matches that, or otherwise Jesus has two ways of being saved. One would be by faith alone, and the other would be by obedience. That doesn't make sense. And now we know Pisteuo has this other meaning, and we would have known that anyway if we just look backwards at the meaning of Aman. And the problem with Paul is he doesn't get it. Okay. So Genesis 15:6 was talking about not a belief in what God had said, basically a promise. It was that he turned towards God and amoned unto God. He was steadfastly paying attention to God and then counted it to righteousness for God. That was what the subject of the second verb of that Genesis 15:6 passages. It's Abraham still the subject of the second verb. There was no change in subject. There's no article name he, contrary to how the KJV drops in a pseudo he right in front of counted, but it's not there. It's just Abraham believed Aman unto God and counted to him for righteousness. So he turned himself steadfastly towards God, and we would say much more than faith. It's a steadfastness, turning to God and counting to God his promise as a righteous deed to Abraham himself. That's all Abraham was saying. Thank you, God. It was a thank you. That's really all he was doing, and that's been blown out of proportion to this crazy. This is I just want to show you. This is insane. The way of salvation has been Genesis 15:6 provided the key for how people were saved in the Old Testament. This is hallucinatory. This is like someone on drugs, LSD, some heroin, cocaine. What are you taking, putting in your veins? Well, what they're putting in their veins is the bias of lies from decades and centuries now. We need to have this fixed, get the Bibles back to where they should have been all along. And that means taking careful time to look at the meaning of words, both in Greek and Hebrew, and fix it. And I pray to God that's what's going to happen. We all need to pray that our translators, our Bibles will be fixed because they're not correct. They're directly went through the hands of completely biased individuals with no ethics, no morals, didn't care about what Jesus really said, only cared what Paul said, because that's who they built their Reformation on. They built it on Romans 4, verses 3-4. That was what Luther built it on. And once they saw the conflict, they were not willing to bend to what Jesus said. And these are disobedient people to the words of Jesus Christ. By no means should we follow suit. We need to fix it. All right. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.